Kill me if you want. But don't look at me like I'm dirt. You think you are nothing. You are the only thing that matters. Amina didn't flinch when the cold steel of the barrel pressed against her temple in that rain-slicked alley. She flinched when the man holding it lowered the weapon and pulled her into a kiss that tasted of rain, iron, and a terrifying kind of hope. She knew her life was over the moment she witnessed the transaction she wasn't supposed to see on the neon-lit fringes of Seoul. But it wasn't until she was trapped in the back of a black sedan, staring at the dragon tattoo snaking up her captor's neck, that the truth took hold. He wasn't just a murderer. He wasn't a monster to be escaped. And when Kang Jun-suk gripped her chin with a hand that had just signed a death warrant, not to hurt her but to anchor her, she finally understood she hadn't found a grave. She had been claimed as the only weakness of a man who ruled by blood. Welcome back to the Afro-Korean Story Space channel, besties. Today's story is a special request for Amina. You asked for a story about finding light in the darkest of places, and here it is. If you're watching, drop a Nigeria to Seoul in the comments right now. To my loyal besties, stay tuned until the very end. The way Jun-suk protects her in Chapter 8 will leave you breathless. If you leave now, you'll be wondering about that final kiss all night long. Are you ready for a story about a woman who had nothing left until she became everything to the most dangerous man in Korea? Let me know if you're excited for this suspense in the comments. The smell of burning rubber and kerosene still clung to Amina's memories like a second skin, a bitter perfume of the night her life turned to ash. Back in Nigeria, the world had been vibrant, filled with the rhythmic pulse of the Lagos markets and the steady promise of her university studies. But promise was a fragile thing when held in the hands of a man like her uncle, a man who viewed his family not as blood, but as collateral. He had gambled on a future he couldn't afford, borrowing from shadows that didn't know the meaning of mercy. The betrayal hadn't come with a shout, but with a quiet disappearance. Amina remembered the evening clearly. The sun dipping low, casting long orange shadows over her father's small compound, and the sudden terrifying arrival of men with cold eyes and heavy boots. They didn't just want the money her uncle had squandered. They wanted a payment that would sting for a lifetime. By the time the first match was struck, her uncle was already gone, leaving Amina to watch as the only home she had ever known was consumed by hungry orange flames. She had stood in the street, her simple cotton dress smudged with soot, clutching a handful of documents and her passport, the only thing she'd managed to save before the roof groaned and collapsed. Her father's face, etched with a mixture of shame and absolute terror, haunted her more than the fire itself. "Run, Amina," he had whispered, his voice cracking like the dry earth of the north. "If they find you, you become the debt." With no home to return to and no family left to protect her, she had fled into the unknown, carrying nothing but the quiet strength of a woman who had already seen the end of her world. Every step away from the smoking ruins of her past felt like walking into a void. She had been stripped of her name, her status, and her dreams, reduced to a ghost wandering through international terminals and strange cities. By the time she reached the neon-drenched streets of Seoul, Amina was a shell, a woman who had learned that hope was a luxury she could no longer afford. She was a stranger in a land of steel and glass, waiting for the moment the shadows would finally catch up to her, unaware that she was about to walk out of the ash and into the arms of a different kind of fire. Seoul was a city that never slept, but for Amina, it was a city that never saw her. She moved through the rain-slicked back alleys of Itaewon and Gangnam like a ghost, a silhouette of deep brown skin lost against the blinding glare of neon signs and towering glass. Her life had become a rhythmic struggle for invisibility. By day, she washed dishes in the humid backrooms of small diners until her fingers pruned, and by night, she retreated to a cramped, windowless room that smelled of damp concrete. She was 24 years old, yet she felt like a woman who had lived a century. Her soft facial features permanently etched with the tension of someone waiting for the floor to give way. The simple worn beige top she wore was a map of her poverty, frayed at the edges and stained by the world she inhabited. She had learned the hard way that in Korea's glittering capital, people like her, immigrants with no status and nothing left, were either ignored or exploited. She kept her hair pulled back and her eyes down, clinging to the quiet strength that had carried her across oceans. But survival in the shadows meant sharing space with the things that lived there, and the shadows of Seoul were long and dangerous. One Tuesday night, the air heavy with the scent of ozone and frying oil, Amina took a shortcut through a narrow corridor between two industrial warehouses to avoid a police patrol. The silence of the alley was suddenly punctured by the low, guttural hum of a luxury engine. She froze, pressing her back against a cold brick wall as a black sedan glided into the space like a predator. 3 men stepped out, their tailored suits sharp enough to cut, but it was the 4th man who stopped the breath in her lungs. He was tall and lean, his hair slicked back with a precision that bordered on lethal. Even from the darkness, she could see the angular stern lines of his face and the dark tattoo snaking up the side of his neck, a mark of power in a world that didn't follow the law. This was the underworld her father had whispered about back in Nigeria, the kind of dangerous people who didn't negotiate. Amina watched, trembling, as a silver briefcase was exchanged for a heavy, taped-up parcel. It was a transaction of shadows, a moment of absolute vulnerability for the powerful man with the ink on his skin. Just as the deal closed, Amina's foot slipped on a patch of wet moss, her shoulder striking a metal trash bin with a resounding clang. The sound was an explosion in the silence. The tall man didn't flinch. He simply turned, his piercing gaze cutting through the darkness to lock onto her terrified brown eyes. In that second, the truth cracked open. Amina had seen the face of the dragon, and in his world, witnesses didn't get to walk away. The air in the alleyway turned to ice as the tall man in the long black coat stepped away from the car, his movements carrying the terrifying grace of a predator. Amina's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She knew how this story ended for girls with no one to miss them. One of the men in suits reached into his jacket, his intent clear, but a sharp single-word command in Korean stopped him in his tracks. Kong Jun-suk approached her, his shadow stretching long over her worn trousers and trembling frame. Up close, he was even more intimidating. His face was a mask of cold authority, his hair slicked back with a precision that felt like a blade. The tattoo on his neck pulsed as the muscles in his jaw tightened. He stopped inches from her, close enough for Amina to smell his expensive cologne and see the sharp, calculated intensity in his eyes. He studied her, not as a person but as a problem to be solved. "You saw," he said, his voice a deep, resonant rasp that vibrated in her chest. Amina lifted her chin, her dark fingers clutching the edge of her beige top. "I saw nothing," she whispered, her voice cracking but her gaze refusing to drop. "I am nothing. Just let me go." Something flickered in Jun-suk's stern expression, a spark of amusement or perhaps a recognition of the quiet strength she carried despite her rags. He reached out, his gloved hand catching her jaw. His grip was firm, a gesture of absolute possession rather than affection. He didn't see a witness to be eliminated. He saw a rarity, a woman who looked at him with terror but didn't beg. "Nothingness is a dangerous thing to be, Amina Okafor," he murmured, reading the name from the ID card one of his men had snatched from her fallen bag. He leaned in, his face inches from hers, his presence an overwhelming force that made her pulse do strange things. "The men I work with would burn you just to see the light. But I think I have a better use for you." He didn't give her a choice. With a subtle nod to his subordinates, he guided her toward the black sedan. It wasn't a kidnapping in the traditional sense. It was a claiming. As the car door clicked shut, sealing her into a world of leather, silence, and the scent of danger, Amina realized her life of hiding was over. She had been plucked from the fringes and dropped into the center of a gilded cage, kept by a man who lived by violence and ruled by fear. She was no longer a ghost in soul. She was the property of its most dangerous shadow. The penthouse suite was a masterpiece of cold marble and floor-to-ceiling glass, a stark contrast to the damp, windowless room Amina had called home for months. It was a gilded cage that hovered above the glittering lights of Seoul, silent and smelling of expensive cedar. Amina stood by the window, her dark fingers tracing the edge of her worn beige top, feeling like an unwanted smudge on the perfection of Jun-suk's world. She was safe from the police and the shadows of her past, but she was now a guest of the man who controlled those very shadows. Life with Jun-suk was a study in contradictions. Amina watched from the periphery as he navigated his empire with a ruthlessness that made her blood run cold. One afternoon, through the cracked door of his office, she saw him standing over a man who had dared to embezzle from his accounts. Jun-suk didn't shout. He simply stood there, his long black coat making him look like a dark god. His face angular and stern as he delivered a sentence that left the man trembling on the floor. He was a man feared by many, a leader who lived by rules written in blood. Yet, when the doors closed and the soldiers disappeared, a different man emerged in the silence. Amina would find small, quiet gestures of care that he never acknowledged. A tray of jollof rice, prepared by a specialist chef to taste exactly like the markets of Lagos, would appear on her table. A stack of university textbooks, the ones she had lost in the fire, was placed in her room without a word. When she had a nightmare, waking up with a silent scream as the smell of Nigerian kerosene filled her mind, she would find him sitting in the armchair in the corner of her room. His eyes closed, his presence a silent, protective shield against the dark. He never touched her, yet his gaze was heavy with a possession that felt more intimate than a kiss. He was a predator who had chosen her as the only person he allowed close, a man of violence who used that same violence to ensure her peace. Amina found herself caught in a tense sanctuary, leaning into the safety he provided while fearing the man who provided it. She began to realize that while the world saw a monster, she was seeing a man who was softening, however slightly, for her alone. The tension in her shoulders didn't disappear, but it shifted, turning from the fear of a victim into the longing of a woman who was finally being seen. The golden luxury of the penthouse soon revealed its hidden edge, a sharp reminder that safety in a world of violence was merely a different kind of peril. Amina began to notice the shift in the atmosphere, the way Jun-suk's men looked at her not with indifference, but with a calculating hunger, as if she were a vital piece of a game they were desperate to win. She was no longer just a witness he had claimed. She was the only point of softness on a man made of stone, and in the underworld, a weakness was an invitation. The reality of her position crashed down upon her during a rare evening when Jun-suk was delayed by a meeting in the city's heart. As she sat in the expansive living area, the elevator chimed, but it wasn't the rhythmic, heavy footfalls of her protector that followed. Instead, the air grew thick with a sudden, suffocating tension. A man she didn't recognize, scarred and dressed in a suit that lacked Jun-suk's refined elegance, stepped into the light, his eyes scanning the room until they landed on her. He didn't speak. He simply smiled, a slow, predatory baring of teeth that told her he knew exactly who she was and what she meant to the boss. "So, this is the Nigerian flower Jun-suk is hiding from the sun," the stranger murmured, his voice oily and devoid of the respect the others showed her. He took a step forward, and Amina felt the familiar cold of the Nigeria fires licking at her heels. She realized then that her presence in this house wasn't just a sanctuary. It was a beacon for every enemy Jun-suk had ever made. If they couldn't break the dragon, they would burn the only thing he allowed close. When Jun-suk finally arrived, his presence immediately scattering the threat like smoke, the look on his face wasn't one of relief, but of a dark, brooding fury. He saw the way Amina's hands trembled against her beige top and the way she retreated into the shadows of the room. He didn't offer words of comfort. Instead, he doubled the guard at her door and sharpened the edges of his own ruthlessness. Amina looked out at the Seoul skyline, realizing that the gilded cage was now a fortress, and the price of his protection was being the ultimate prize in a war she never asked to fight. Amina stood before the massive, gold-framed mirror in the master suite, staring at the woman looking back at her. The glass was flawless, unlike the cracked, salt-stained hand mirrors she had used in Nigeria, but the clarity felt like an indictment. She was no longer the girl who had arrived in Seoul with ash under her fingernails and desperation in her stride. Her deep brown skin, once dull from exhaustion and the harsh sun of Lagos, now glowed under the soft recessed lighting of the penthouse. She reached up to touch her hair, which was no longer messy from a long, difficult day but styled with a precision that matched the room's cold elegance. She was still wearing the simple beige top and plain trousers, the last remnants of her life of struggle, but they looked out of place against the backdrop of silk sheets and marble floors. She realized she was a stranger to herself. The quiet strength she had always carried was still there, but it was being forged into something sharper, something more resilient, shaped by the weight of Jun-suk's world. The reflection showed a woman who was no longer just surviving. She was being refined into a consort for a king of the underworld. She saw the way her posture had changed. The tense, emotional curve of her shoulders had straightened into a defensive line. She was becoming a part of the gilded cage, a creature of the shadows she once feared. The pain, betrayal, and loss that had defined her were now the foundation of a new identity she didn't yet recognize. In the mirror's edge, she saw the ghost of the girl from the markets, the one who dreamt of university and a simple life. That girl was dying, replaced by the woman who waited for a man with a dragon on his neck. Amina realized that the luxury surrounding her wasn't a gift. It was a transformation. She was being polished like a diamond, but diamonds were only created under immense, crushing pressure. As she traced a finger over the smooth glass, she wondered if she was becoming the very thing she used to run from, a person defined by the power of others. She wasn't just Junsook's only person anymore. She was becoming his reflection, a silent partner in a world where mercy was a myth and survival was the only law. The silence of the penthouse was different tonight. It wasn't the heavy, suffocating quiet of a prison, but the expectant hush of a sanctuary. Amina sat on the edge of the plush velvet sofa, her eyes drawn once again to Junsook as he discarded his long black coat. In the soft amber glow of the living room, he looked less like a distant god of the underworld and more like a man burdened by the weight of his own empire. He loosened his tie, and as he turned, the light caught the intricate ink on his neck, the scales of the dragon snaking upward, disappearing beneath his hairline. "You've been staring at it for weeks," Junsook said, his voice a low rumble that didn't carry its usual edge of command. He sat in the chair opposite her, the distance between them feeling smaller than it ever had before. Amina didn't look away this time. "In my home, we say that a person's skin tells the story of where they have been. I look at yours and I see a war." Junsook reached up, his fingers tracing the dark lines of the tattoo. "This wasn't a choice. It was a brand. In the beginning it was to show who I belong to. Now it shows who belongs to me." He leaned forward, the sharp angles of his face softening in the shadows. "People see the dragon and they run. They think it's a symbol of power. They don't realize it's actually a map of every scar I've had to cover up." Amina felt a sudden, sharp pang of recognition. She looked down at her own hands, the hands that had clutched her passport while her home burned, the hands that had scrubbed floors in the dark to stay alive. "I don't have ink," she whispered, "but I am covered in maps too. My scars are just on the inside. They are made of fire and the faces of people who walked away when I needed them most." For the first time, Junsook's gaze wasn't one of possession, but of profound understanding. He saw the pain, betrayal, and loss she carried, and he didn't try to fix it. He simply acknowledged it. "The world thinks because we have survived, we are made of stone," he murmured, his eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that made her breath hitch. "But the dragon only bites because it is protecting a heart that was broken long ago." In that moment, the gap between the Nigerian woman with nothing and the Korean boss with everything vanished. They were just two survivors sitting in a glass tower, recognizing the ghosts they both carried. Amina realized that the dragon wasn't just a mark of the Mafia. It was a shield, much like the quiet strength she wore every day. As the night deepened, the air between them shifted, no longer filled with the static of fear, but with the heavy, undeniable pull of two broken things finally finding a piece that fit. The sirens wailing in the distance were the only warning before the glass of the balcony door shattered, spraying the marble floor with diamond-like shards. The sanctuary had been breached. Junsook was on his feet in a heartbeat, his long black coat billowing like a dark omen as he pulled a handgun from the small of his back. His face was no longer the soft mask of the man who had shared his scars. It was the angular, lethal visage of the boss who lived by the gun. He shoved Amina behind the heavy oak desk, his grip firm and protective, his body a living shield between her and the encroaching shadows. "Stay down," he commanded, his voice a harsh rasp that brooked no argument. But as the door to the suite kicked open and the flash of gunfire lit the room in strobe-like bursts, Amina didn't feel the paralyzing terror that had defined her night in Nigeria. She didn't feel like the victim whose home was being burned. Instead, seeing Junsuk standing in the line of fire for her, a man who was feared by the world but emotionally attached only to her, sparked a fire in her own chest. She saw the tension in his neck, the way the dragon tattoo pulsed with every shot he fired, and she realized that if he fell, her world didn't just end, it vanished. In the sudden ringing silence that followed the retreat of the first wave of attackers, Junsuk turned to check on her, his eyes wild and bloodshot with adrenaline. He reached out to touch her face, his hand shaking with a rare, raw tremor. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, his voice cracking with a vulnerability he couldn't hide. Amina didn't answer with words. She rose from the floor, her simple beige top smudged with plaster dust, and grabbed his coat with both hands, clutching the heavy fabric as if he might disappear into the smoke. She leaned into him, her eyes closing as she tilted her head back. Before he could pull away or bark another order, she pressed her lips to his. It was a fatal kiss. Fatal because it killed the cold, calculated distance he had maintained for years. It was a kiss that tasted of iron, rain, and a deep, desperate release. Amina poured all her pain, betrayal, and loss into that single contact, and for the first time, she felt the man of stone crumble. His grip on her waist tightened, his fingers digging into her skin not with the coldness of possession, but with the heat of a man who had finally found the only person he allowed close. The icy exterior of the Korean Mafia boss shattered more completely than the glass on the floor, leaving behind only the man who would burn the world down to keep her safe. The smoke from the confrontation still hung in the air, but the chaos of the night had settled into a heavy, reverent silence. Amina stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of the penthouse, the morning sun beginning to crest over the Seoul skyline, painting the city in shades of rose and gold. She was no longer wearing the beige top. It had been replaced by a robe of deep emerald silk that felt like cool water against her skin. She looked at her reflection and finally recognized the woman staring back. The quiet strength she had carried from Nigeria was no longer a tool for survival. It was the foundation of her throne. Behind her, the doors to the suite opened. Junsuk stepped in, his presence as commanding as ever, though the lethal sharpness of his gaze softened the moment it landed on her. He had spent the night purging the shadows, ensuring that no one would ever dare breach their sanctuary again. The dragon tattoo on his neck was visible above his collar, a mark of the beast that the world feared, but to Amina, it was simply the mark of the man who had given her a reason to hope. He stopped beside her, his hand resting firmly yet tenderly on the small of her back. He didn't look at the city. He looked at her. "The men are waiting," he said, his voice a low, steady rumble. "They need to see who holds the heart of this empire." Amina took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment. She remembered the girl with nothing left, the girl who had been stripped of her home and her dignity. That girl was gone, burned away in the fires of betrayal and reborn in the heat of a mafia boss's devotion. She wasn't his captive, his witness, or his nothing anymore. She was his equal, the one person allowed behind the mask of the dragon. "Let them wait," she murmured, leaning her head against his shoulder for a brief, private second. "Let them see that I am not just someone you protected. I am the reason you fight." As they walked toward the doors together, Amina realized her journey from nothing to everything was complete. She stepped out into the hallway where his generals and soldiers stood in a disciplined line, their heads bowing in unison as she passed. She walked with her chin held high, her dark hand intertwined with Junsuk's pale, scarred fingers. She was Amina Okafor, a daughter of Nigeria and the queen of a Korean empire, standing tall in a world that had tried to break her, but ended up bowing at her feet.